The city was restless that evening. The rain had just begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, beating down against the rooftops and running through the narrow streets like 1,000 tiny rivers. Traffic was heavy, horns echoed, and people hurried under umbrellas as if they knew something dark was coming. Among them was a man who carried no umbrella. His shirt clung to his body, soaked through, but he did not seem to care. His mind was elsewhere. His name was Daniel, a single father who worked as a part-time security guard at a nearby office block. Life had been unkind to him, but he had grown used to hardship. What mattered most to him was his little daughter, Emily, waiting at home for him with a smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. Daniel's steps were heavy, not just because of exhaustion, but because he carried the weight of many burdens. Ever since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, he had done everything he could to keep their small family together. He worked long shifts, took odd jobs, and often went hungry so Emily could eat. Yet, despite his struggles, he carried himself with quiet strength. People barely noticed him on the street, but if they looked closer, they would have seen in his eyes a man who had endured pain and chosen to keep going, no matter the cost. That night, fate placed him on a path he never expected. At the same time, across the city, a woman sat in the back of a sleek black car. Her driver maneuvered carefully through the crowded streets while men in dark suits followed and other vehicles behind. Her name was Claire, the CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the city. She was known for her sharp mind, her unshakable will, and the empire she had built from the ground up. But behind her strength lay another story. Claire was pregnant, carrying her first child. She was both respected and feared in the corporate world, but in private, she was lonely, vulnerable, and often afraid. Enemies circled her like vultures. Rivals who wanted her company, criminals who wanted her silence. Even those within her circle whispered about her downfall. Yet she kept her head high, hiding her fears behind an armor of confidence. Tonight she was traveling home after a tense meeting, unaware that her enemies had chosen this very evening to strike. The rain grew heavier as her convoy moved through the main avenue. Neon lights blurred in the downpour. Daniel, meanwhile, had just finished his shift and was making his way home, taking the same street where Claire's convoy was passing. He noticed the black cars, the tinted windows, and the way they cut through. Traffic like blades. Something about it caught his eye, but he thought nothing of it at first. He was just another man trying to get home to his child. Then it happened. The roar of gunfire split the air. Shouts rang out as masked men appeared from the shadows, armed and merciless. They blocked the convoy with stolen vehicles, forcing Claire's car to a sudden stop. Her guards rushed out, weapons drawn, but the attackers were prepared. Bullets cracked against metal, glass shattered, and screams filled the street. People ran in panic, scattering in every direction. Cars swerved and crashed as chaos swallowed the avenue. Daniel froze for only a moment before instinct took over. He saw the black car at the center of it all, saw the terrified faces inside, and saw the pregnant woman being dragged out by her attackers. He could have turned away, could have run like everyone else. But something deep inside him refused. Remembered his daughter's face. He remembered his wife's last words, telling him to always protect what was right and good. His body moved before his mind could think. Daniel charged forward through the rain and smoke. He reached Claire just as one of the masked men raised his weapon at her. Without hesitation, Daniel threw himself between them. Shot rang out, piercing the night, and the burning pain of the bullet tore through his shoulder. His knees nearly buckled, but he did not fall. He spread his arms wide, shielding Claire with his body, his own blood mixing with the rain. The attackers hesitated. For a moment, time froze. Here was a stranger, a man with no armor, no weapon, no reason to fight yet. He stood like an unbreakable wall between them and their target. Claire's eyes widened as she looked at him. She had never seen him before, yet in that instant, she saw something she had not felt in years. Genuine sacrifice. Run. Daniel shouted over his shoulder. His voice was rough, filled with both pain and determination. But Claire could not run. She was frozen, clutching her stomach, feeling the fragile life inside her twist with fear. The world around her was chaos, but all she could see was this wounded man standing in front of her, refusing to let her fall. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police and military units were rushing to the scene, their lights piercing through the storm. The attackers realized their time was running out. Shots cracked again, glass and stone shattering, but they began to retreat, melting back into the alleys. One of them snarled in frustration, glaring at Daniel as if promising that this was not over.
Ow.
Then, as quickly as it had begun, the street grew quiet again, littered with shattered glass, burning vehicles, and the cries of the wounded. Daniel collapsed to one knee, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. His breath came in ragged gasps. Claire knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to steady him. Her guards finally surrounded them, forming a protective circle. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" Daniel looked at her with tired eyes. "Because you are carrying a child, because it was the right thing to do." Those words sank deep into her heart. For years she had lived in a world where every action was measured by profit, gain, or advantage. But here was a man who had reason to protect her, who owed her nothing, yet had given his blood for her safety. The rain washed over them, carrying away the smoke and dust, leaving only silence. Claire's convoy was damaged, her guards shaken, and her enemies had escaped into the night. All she could think about was the man beside her, the stranger who had stood against death to shield her and her unborn child. Paramedics arrived quickly, lifting Daniel onto a stretcher. He drifted in and out of consciousness. His last sight before darkness claimed him was Claire's face leaning over him, her expression filled with something he never expected, gratitude and sorrow. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens carried him away, Claire remained standing in the rain, her hand pressed against her stomach, her mind racing. She had always believed she was untouchable, that her power and wealth could protect her. But tonight proved otherwise. Tonight it was a man with nothing who had saved everything. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The hospital room was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines and the steady rhythm of rain outside the window. Daniel lay on the bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. Every breath was shallow but steady. He had survived, though his body ached as if fire had been poured through his veins. Yet in his half-dream state, he thought not of the pain, but of his daughter Emily, wondering if she was safe at home, waiting for her father who had promised to be back before bedtime. When Daniel opened his eyes fully, the first thing he saw was the dull light of morning filtering through the curtains. The second thing he saw left him confused. A woman was sitting quietly by his bedside, her hands folded over her stomach. She was the same woman from the chaos, the one he had thrown himself in front of. Her clothes had been changed, her hair tied back neatly, but her eyes carried the same weight he remembered from the night before. Claire had stayed. She had ignored the advice of her board members, her security team, even the police who insisted she return to her mansion immediately. Instead, she had insisted on being near the man who had saved her life. She could not explain it to herself. Perhaps it was guilt, or gratitude, or something else entirely. But she felt a pull she had never felt before. Daniel stirred his lips. Dry, his voice barely a whisper. "Emily." Claire leaned closer. "Your daughter is safe," she said softly. "Your neighbor's looking after her. I made sure of it." Relief washed over him, though confusion followed quickly. "Why? Are you here?" For a moment Claire had no answer. She was used to commanding rooms, to negotiating billion-dollar contracts, to standing tall against rivals who wanted her ruined. Yet now, sitting before this wounded stranger, her words faltered. Finally she said, "Because you risked everything for me. For my child, I could not leave without knowing you were alive." Daniel closed his eyes, not out of weakness, but to absorb her words. He had not acted for recognition, nor reward. He had acted because, in that instant, he had seen an innocent life at risk. But hearing her voice, steady yet carrying a softness hidden beneath layers of steel, stirred something within him. The hours passed slowly. Nurses came and went, adjusting his checking his wounds. Reporters tried to swarm the hospital, but Claire's guards kept them at bay. Whispers filled the corridors about the powerful CEO and the unknown man who had thrown himself into the line of fire. It was a story that caught everyone's attention, not because of money or power, but because of sacrifice. Daniel's recovery would not be easy. The bullet had torn muscle and grazed bone, leaving him in pain with every movement. Yet he never once complained. He asked only for his daughter. Claire noticed this. She noticed how his first thought was never himself, but the small girl waiting. For him, she noticed how he endured silently, with the quiet strength of a man who had faced struggle his whole life and learned to keep standing. When evening came, Claire received a call. Her board members demanded answers. Investors were nervous. Her enemies had already begun spreading rumors of weakness, questioning her ability to lead while pregnant. She should have been in her office, fighting back with the sharpness she was known for, but she stayed. She stayed because when she looked at Daniel, she felt a truth she had long forgotten, that leadership was not just about power, but about humanity. At one point, Daniel turned his head toward her, his eyes steady despite his exhaustion. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "You are in your own world to protect." "I know," Claire replied, her hand gently resting on her stomach. "But last night, you protected mine." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the rain eased, replaced by the distant hum of city life. Inside, two people from different worlds sat together, bound by something stronger than circumstance. By the next morning, Daniel insisted on being discharged. The doctors argued against it, but he was determined. His daughter needed him, and he could not afford hospital bills. Claire watched him struggle to stand, watched the way he hid his pain behind clenched teeth, and something inside her broke. This man had given his blood for her, yet now he was forced to walk away as if nothing had happened. She made a decision then, a decision that went against logic, against advice, against everything she had built her life on. She would not let him disappear back into the shadows of the city. That night, as Daniel sat at home with Emily, trying to pretend everything was normal despite the bandage pulling at his shoulder, there was a knock at the door. It was late, and he frowned, wondering who it could be. When he opened the door, his breath caught. There she was, Claire. Not surrounded by guards or assistants, not hidden behind tinted glass or towering buildings. Just her, standing in the dim light of his modest apartment hallway, holding a small bag of groceries in her arms. Emily peeked out from behind her father, her eyes wide with curiosity. Claire smiled softly at the little girl before looking back. At Daniel. "I owed you thanks," she said simply. "But more than that, I came because I wanted to see you not as a stranger who saved me, but as the man who stood when no one else did." Daniel stood in silence, torn between disbelief and caution. He was a single father living paycheck to paycheck. She was a powerful CEO, carrying the future of an empire. Their worlds did not mix. And yet here she was, standing at his door, as if the lines between them had vanished. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something stir in his chest, not hope exactly, but the faint echo of it. And as Emily tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, can she come in?" he realized that perhaps fate was not finished with them yet. That night in that small apartment, something new began. Asterisk the moment Claire stepped inside Daniel's apartment. The difference between their worlds could not have been clearer. The room was small, the paint on the walls faded, and the furniture worn from years of use. Yet despite its modesty, there was warmth in the air. Children's drawings were taped onto the refrigerator, a small bookshelf held well-used storybooks, and the faint smell of homemade soup lingered in the kitchen. It was not a mansion filled with glass and marble, but it was a home. Emily, wide-eyed and curious, clung to her father's side while sneaking glances at Claire. The little girl had heard stories about powerful people, but she had never imagined one would be standing in their living room. Claire bent down, her hands gently resting on her belly as she offered Emily a kind smile. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice lacking the sharp edge it carried in boardrooms. "I brought some food. Would you like to help me unpack it?" Emily hesitated, then looked at her father for approval. Daniel gave a small nod, still bewildered by the scene unfolding before him. Emily's face brightened, and she quickly grabbed the bag from Claire's hands, running to the kitchen counter with excitement. Claire followed, moving slowly, her steps careful under the weight of her pregnancy. Daniel watched, unsure of what to make of this. He was a man who had spent years avoiding attention, living quietly, focusing only on his daughter. Yet here was the most powerful woman he had ever seen, standing in his kitchen. Unpacking groceries, as if she belonged there, the silence between them grew heavy until Daniel finally spoke. "You should not be here. This is not your world." Claire turned, her expression unreadable. "Maybe not. But last night you stepped into mine without hesitation. You did not belong there either, yet you stood when everyone else ran. Tonight, I am the one stepping where I do not belong." Daniel had no answer. He lowered himself carefully into a chair, his wounded shoulder aching with every movement. Claire noticed and quickly moved to help, but he waved her off. "It managed worse," he muttered, but Claire was not convinced. She had seen his blood on the street, seen his body collapse to the ground. That image was burned into her memory, a reminder that his pain was real and not something to be brushed aside. She had spent her life surrounded by people who valued profit over people. But here was a man who had risked everything for someone he did not know. It unsettled her in ways she did not fully understand. Emily, meanwhile, had warmed to her guest. She proudly showed Claire her drawings, her favorite books, and even a cracked doll she had held onto since her mother's passing. Claire listened. With patience, her hand occasionally resting on her stomach, as if to remind herself that soon her own child would be in the world. For a fleeting moment, she felt something she had not felt in years belonging. Later, when Emily had gone to bed, the apartment grew quiet again. Daniel and Claire sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, a single lamp casting soft light between them. The city outside buzzed with distant traffic, but within these walls, the world felt still. "You risked your life for me," Claire said, her voice low but steady. "Most people would have run. Why didn't you?" Daniel's gaze fell to his, hands calloused from years of work. "Because I saw someone who needed help, and because you are carrying a child. I could not let harm come to you or your baby. I have a daughter. I know what it means to want to protect them at any cost." Tears. Words struck something deep inside her. She had built her empire on power and calculation, but power had not protected her last night. It had been stripped away in an instant, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. And it was not wealth or influence that had saved her, it was this man. With nothing but courage in his heart, Claire leaned back, her eyes studying him carefully. "Do you know who I am?" Daniel gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Everyone knows who you are. Claire Donovan, the woman who built an empire. The woman people say is untouchable. And yet," Claire said softly, "I was not untouchable last night." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Claire broke it by asking about his life, and slowly, Daniel opened up. He spoke of his wife, gone too soon, and the promise he had made at her bedside to raise Emily with love and strength. He spoke of the jobs he had taken, the nights he had gone without sleep, the mornings he had walked Emily to school with a smile even when his stomach was empty. He spoke of hardship not with bitterness, but with quiet resilience. Claire listened, and with each word, the distance between their worlds seemed to shrink. She found herself admiring him not just for his bravery, but for his unwavering devotion. To his child was something money could never buy, something she realized she had always longed for, but had never truly found. When the night grew late, Claire rose to leave. Daniel walked her to the door, his movements slow from pain but steady. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the air thick with unspoken words. "Thank you for letting me in," Claire said finally. "I know I must seem out of place here, but I wanted to see the man who saved me, not in a hospital bed, but in his own world." Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond. Before he could find the words, Claire placed a hand gently on his arm. "I will not forget what you did, and this will not be the last time we speak." With that, she stepped out into the night, her guards waiting at a distance. Daniel closed the door slowly, leaning against it with a sigh. He had no idea what path had been set in motion, only that his life went simple, once predictable would never be the same again. And as he looked in on Emily, sleeping peacefully in her small bed, Daniel whispered a promise to himself. Whatever storms were coming, he would face them. For his daughter. For the woman whose life he had saved. The boy, unborn child he had shielded with his own body. In that quiet moment, a bond had been formed when neither of them had sought, yet one that neither of them could deny. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm Daniel had not expected. He tried to return to his routine, waking up early, cooking breakfast for Emily, walking her to school, and pushing through his shifts despite the pain in his shoulder. Life demanded that he keep moving, no matter the injury, no matter the exhaustion. Yet beneath the surface of his ordinary struggle, something had shifted. He carried the memory of that night like a scar, etched deeper than the wound in his body. The echo of gunfire still rang in his ears. The image of the woman he had protected still burned in his mind. Claire had returned to her tower of glass and steel, to her offices filled with advisors and board members, to the empire she ruled with quiet authority. But she too carried something from that night, a face, a sacrifice. A man who had nothing yet gave everything in the span of a heartbeat. Her advisors urged her to focus on the company, to forget the chaos of the ambush, but she could not. The memory followed her even in the stillness of her mansion, where silence felt heavier than any boardroom argument. It was two broken worlds, drawn toward each other by a force neither of them had chosen. One evening, as the city lit itself in neon and shadows, Claire's car stopped outside Daniel's apartment again. Her guards objected, warning of danger, but she silenced them. She carried herself not as a CEO now, but as a woman who needed to understand why her thoughts kept returning. To that man and his little girl. She knocked softly. Once again, Daniel opened the door with the look of someone both surprised and cautious. Inside, Emily was coloring at the kitchen table. Her face lit up when she saw Claire, as though she had been expecting her all along. Claire smiled at the child, then turned her attention to Daniel. "You should not keep coming here," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "It draws attention." "And yet I am here," Claire replied calmly. Daniel wanted to argue, but he saw something in her eyes. He recognized the weariness of someone carrying too much. He stepped aside, and she entered. The night unfolded slowly. Emily chattered happily, showing Claire her drawings while Daniel cooked a simple dinner of rice and vegetables. Claire accepted the meal with gratitude, eating as though she had not tasted something genuine in years. Conversation turned, as it always seemed to, toward life. Claire spoke of her company and the endless war of power that consumed her days. Daniel spoke of raising Emily, of long nights spent worrying about rent and long mornings, pretending everything was fine so his daughter would never see his fear. Two worlds collided in that kitchen, one of skyscrapers and empires, the other of modest walls and worn furniture. And yet as the hours slipped away, they discovered how alike they were in the ways that mattered. Both carried scars of loss. Both had known loneliness that lingered even in crowded rooms. Both lived with the constant weight of protecting someone they loved more than themselves. At one point, Emily fell asleep on the couch, her little hands clutching her crayon box. Daniel covered her with a blanket, then sat back down across from her. "Claire," the air grew quieter, heavier with truths unspoken. "You were strong," Claire said softly, studying him. "But I can see it, the tiredness in your eyes. You have carried too much alone." Daniel gave a faint smile. "It is what fathers do," said mothers, Claire replied, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. Her child shifted within. Her, a reminder of the future she was fighting for. For a long moment, the two simply sat in silence, bound not by their differences, but by the invisible thread of shared struggle. Claire had never allowed anyone this close before, never allowed herself to appear vulnerable. Yet here in this tiny apartment, she found a strange kind of safety. Daniel, on the other hand, had not expected to open his door to someone like her. Yet now her presence felt less like an intrusion and more like a quiet storm reshaping the ground beneath him. Eventually, Claire rose to leave, though not before promising she would return. "Not because I owe you," she said, her voice steady, "but because I find something here I cannot find anywhere else." Daniel watched her go, his thoughts a storm of confusion and curiosity. "I'd never asked for this," never sought it. His life was already a struggle, his days already full, yet part of him knew that something had begun the night he took that bullet, something larger than himself. As her car pulled away into the city lights, Daniel looked once more at his daughter, sleeping peacefully. Then he whispered into the quiet room, "Two worlds should never meet. And yet here we are." What neither of them knew was that forces beyond their control were already moving. The enemies who had failed to strike Claire that night were regrouping. More determined than ever, Daniel, whether he wished it or not, was now a part of her world. Their broken worlds had collided. And from that collision, something new, fragile, yet unshakable, was beginning to rise. The morning sun broke through the city skyline, but for Daniel, the day began the same way it always did. He woke before dawn, prepared breakfast for Emily, and helped her pack her small school bag. His shoulders still ached, the bandages beneath his shirt reminding him of the night that had changed everything. But he moved through the pain with the stubborn determination of a father who had no other choice. Emily chattered happily at the table, unaware of the weight pressing down on her father. He smiled at her often, though behind that smile was a constant storm bills stacked on the counter. Long shifts at work, and the unspoken fear that another attack could happen at any moment. But beneath all those worries lay another thought, one that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit: Claire. He had not seen her in 3 days. After their late-night conversation, after the quiet understanding that had passed between them, she had returned to her world of glass towers and boardrooms. He had convinced himself it was for the best. She belonged to a different world, one he could never step into. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in his kitchen, speaking not as a CEO, but as a woman who carried the same scars he did. That afternoon, while Daniel was at work struggling through his shift, Claire sat in her office. Towers staring out over the city. Her board members argued around the long table, their voices sharp and full of warnings. Investors were nervous, contracts were at risk, and whispers of weakness spread through the corporate world like wildfire. They urged her to step down temporarily, to focus on her child, to let someone else take control until things settled. It was the practical choice, the logical one. But logic had never built her empire. Claire listened in silence, her hands folded calmly over the curve of her stomach. Inside, however, her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Daniel, of the quiet strength in his eyes when he said he did not value wealth, only dignity. She thought of Emily's laughter, the way the little girl clung to her father with trust so pure it made Claire ache. And she thought of the night he had stood before her with nothing but his own body to shield her from death. When the meeting ended, Claire dismissed her advisors with a wave. She remained at the window long after they left, watching the streets. Below, she had all the power in the world, yet for the first time she felt powerless. She wanted to repay Daniel, to lift the weight from his shoulders, but every offer she had made so far, he had refused. Money meant nothing to him. Protection meant little. What he valued was something she could not buy. Later that evening, her decision was made. She arrived at Daniel's apartment once again, her guards stationed reluctantly outside. She carried no groceries this time, no small offerings. She carried only her words. Daniel opened the door, his expression caught between surprise and resignation. "You again," he said softly, though there was no anger in his tone. "I told you this would not be the last time," Claire replied. She stepped inside without waiting for him to move aside, her presence filling the small room. Emily greeted her happily, rushing forward to show her another crayon drawing. And Claire knelt down with a genuine smile, admiring every stroke of color as though it were a masterpiece. When Emily finally went to bed, Claire turned her attention back to Daniel. They sat across from each other at the same worn kitchen table, the lamplight casting shadows across their faces. "You risked your life for me," Claire said quietly. "I want to give something back. Not money, not charity, something real. I can offer you a better job, a safer life for your daughter, a chance to live without fear." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had expected this. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady. "And what would you ask of me in return?" "Nothing," Claire answered firmly. Only that you accept it. Only that you let me repay what you did. Daniel shook his head. You do not understand. If I take something from you, if I step into your world, I lose myself. I do not want to owe anyone. I want to raise my daughter with dignity, not debt. Claire leaned forward, frustration flickering in her eyes. This is not debt. It is gratitude. You bled for me, for my child. Why is it so hard for you to let someone help you? His voice rose slightly, though it was not anger but pain that edged his words. Because every time I accepted help before, it came with chains. Promises that broke, favors that twisted into burdens. I learned the hard way that nothing is free. The only thing I can give Emily is my honesty. And I will not trade that away for comfort. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against them both. Claire stared at him, her chest tightening with emotions she could not name. She had lived her whole life in a world where everything had a price. Deals, loyalty, even trust it, was all bought and sold. Yet here was a man who valued something beyond her reach, something she had spent years searching for without realizing. It, for the first time in a long time, Claire felt small. She lowered her gaze, her voice softer now. Do you think I do not want the same? Do you think I do not long for a world where people choose me for who I am, not for what I own? You have something I lost long ago, Daniel. And perhaps that is why I keep coming back. Daniel looked at her, his expression caught between sympathy and caution. He wanted to believe her, but belief was dangerous. Still, something in her voice, in the way her hand rested protectively on her stomach, told him her words were real. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly from the couch, where she had dozed off. Both adults turned instinctively toward the sound, their eyes meeting again in the dim light. In that moment, neither was a CEO nor a struggling father. They were just two people bound by the same unspoken desire to protect the ones they loved, no matter the cost. Claire stood at last, her composure returning, though her heart remained heavy. You have made your choice, she said quietly. I will respect it. But know this, Daniel, I am not offering charity. I am offering a chance for our worlds to stand together, not apart. She left soon after, her guards falling into step as the car pulled away. Daniel remained at the table. Long into the night, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, her words lingered in the air, stirring something inside him that he could not push away. The power of choice lay heavy on him. He had chosen dignity over wealth, honesty over comfort. Yet deep down he wondered if that choice would one day cost him more than he could bear, not just for himself, but for Emily, and for the woman who refused to let him fade from her world. Asterisk, the city never slept. Neon lights burned against the night sky. Cars rushed down the avenues. And somewhere in the distance, sirens echoed like a constant reminder that danger never truly rested. Daniel stood by the window of his apartment, staring out into the restless streets below. His shoulders still ached with every breath, but that was not what kept him awake. It was the weight of everything pressing down on him, his daughter's safety, the shadow of enemies that had not vanished, and the woman who kept returning to his life despite his efforts to keep her world apart from his. Emily stirred in her sleep, curled beneath her blanket on the couch. He checked on her softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She was the reason he kept going, the reason he had survived all the storms life had thrown at him. And yet, as he looked at her small, peaceful form, he knew the storm was not over. If anything, it was just beginning. The knock at the door came softly but firmly. Daniel stiffened immediately. His hand moved instinctively toward the baseball bat leaning against the wall near the door. He had grown used to caution, looked through the peephole, and felt both relief and unease when he saw her. Claire. He opened the door, his voice low. It is late, I know, Claire said, her tone calm, but carrying an urgency he could not ignore. But I could not wait. She stepped inside, her guards again stationed reluctantly outside. Her presence filled the small apartment, though she carried no arrogance with her, only a strange vulnerability hidden beneath her steady posture. Emily murmured in her sleep but did not wake. Daniel closed the door and turned to her. What? Is it this time? He asked. Claire looked at him for a long moment, then spoke. They will not stop. The attack that night was not the end. My enemies have grown bolder, and they will strike again. And when they do, they will not hesitate to come after those I am close to. That means you. That means your daughter." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had expected as much, though hearing it aloud made the air feel heavier. "Then you should stay away," he said firmly. "The closer you come, the more danger you bring." Her eyes softened, though her voice held steel. "Do you think distance will protect you? They know who you are now. You're not invisible anymore. You stood in their way, and they will not forget that. You are part of this whether you like it or not." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. He hated the truth in her words. He had spent years protecting Emily by keeping his life small, by avoiding attention, by walking quietly in the shadows. But the night he stepped in front of that bullet, everything changed. The shadows were gone. He was marked now. Claire stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I cannot erase what happened. But I can promise you this: I will not let harm come to you or your daughter, not while I still breathe." Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers. She meant it. He could see it in the way she stood in, the way her hand rested protectively over her stomach. She was not speaking as a CEO or as a woman of power. She was speaking as a mother, as someone who understood what it meant to protect a life at any cost. "Why me?" Daniel asked finally, his voice quiet. "Why put yourself at risk for me?" "Because you did the same for me," Claire answered without hesitation. "You did not know me, yet you bled for me. You shielded me with your body. That is not something I can forget. And maybe," she paused, her voice softening, "maybe because I feel safer standing beside you than I do behind walls of steel and glass." The silence between them was heavy, but it was not empty. Daniel turned away, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to refuse her again, to push her away, to protect Emily by keeping their worlds separate. But part of him knew it was too late. The night of the ambush had bound them together in ways neither of them could undo. Finally, he spoke. "If you stay close to me, you bring danger into my daughter's life. I cannot allow that." Claire's gaze hardened, but her voice remained calm. "And if I leave, danger still finds you. The only difference is that you will be alone when it comes, at least with me. You will not face it without protection." Her words cut through him like a blade. He had lived his whole life carrying burdens alone. But now she was offering something he had never allowed himself to have: someone to stand beside him. He looked at her again.
I really looked at her.
She was powerful, yes, but also fragile in ways she never showed the world. She was a woman carrying both an empire and an unborn child. Yet here she was, standing in his small apartment, offering him not money, not power, but solidarity. At last Daniel nodded. "If we do this, it is not for money, not for favors. It is because our children deserve to grow up safe. Nothing more." Claire's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Nothing more," she agreed. That night marked a shift. They sat together long into the hours, speaking quietly about plans, about the future, about the dangers that loomed. Daniel shared his fears openly for the first time, while Claire revealed vulnerabilities she had hidden from even her closest allies. The apartment, though small and worn, became a sanctuary where two lives once divided by worlds began to find common ground. As dawn approached, Claire prepared to leave. She paused at the door, looking back at him. "You are more than you believe, Daniel. Do not forget that." When she was gone, Daniel stood for a long time in the silence, her words echoing in his mind. He looked at Emily, still asleep, and then at the faint light creeping through the curtains. Something inside him had shifted. For years he had fought to protect his daughter alone, but now he carried a promise, not just for her, but for another life as well. He touched his shoulder, feeling the scar beneath the bandage, and whispered to himself, "If I must stand, then I will stand for them." Both. It was no longer just about survival. It was about protection, about a vow made in the quiet hours of the night. A vow that would bind him to Claire and her unborn child in ways neither of them yet understood, and though danger circled closer with every passing day, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. he would keep that promise, even if it cost him everything. The days that followed were unlike anything Daniel had ever known. For years, his life had been built on repetition work. Exhaustion, meals scraped together, nights spent telling Emily stories until she fell asleep. But now there was something different in the air, something heavier, and yet strangely brighter. Claire had kept her word. She came often, sometimes with quiet company, sometimes with guards, watching nervously from outside, always with the same calm presence that unsettled and steadied him at the same time. At first, Daniel struggled to accept her closeness. He worried about the eyes that followed her, about the threats circling her name, about the danger that seemed to trail her every step. But when he looked at Emily, laughing with Claire as if she had known her forever, he realized that pushing Claire away no longer made sense. Their lives had crossed in a way that could not be undone. One afternoon, as autumn leaves swept across the streets, Claire arrived with something Daniel had not expected. It was not food or clothes or offers of money. It was a small music box, old and worn, its surface polished by years of use. She placed it gently in Emily's hands. "It belonged to my mother," Claire said softly. "She gave it to me when I was a girl, and it was the only thing that helped me sleep at night. I want you to have it now." Emily's eyes lit up as she wound the little key and watched the ballerina twirl inside, the delicate melody filling the room. He had nothing so precious to give his daughter, only his endless work and sacrifice. Yet here was this woman, offering part of her past with a sincerity that could not be faked. Later, when Emily had gone to bed with the music box resting by her pillow, Daniel spoke. "Why give her something so valuable? You barely know us." Claire met his gaze without flinching. "I know enough. I know you would die for her. I know she is your whole world. And I know that when I look at her, I see the innocence I want my child to have one day. It feels right." Daniel did not answer. Words were hard when emotions pressed so deep, but something shifted inside him again. The weeks turned into months. Claire's enemies did not vanish. They grew louder, more desperate. There were close calls, threatening letters slipped under doors, shadows lingering too long outside. Yet through it all, Daniel remained unshaken. He watched, he listened, he stood ready. He was no trained soldier, but he had something many of her guards lacked: the unyielding will of a father who refused to let harm touch those under his care. Claire noticed. She saw the way he placed himself instinctively between danger and his daughter. She saw how he studied every street, every stranger, every sound that did not belong. He became more than a protector, he became an anchor. And in her quiet moments, when the world outside demanded her strength, she found comfort in knowing he was there. One evening, after a particularly long day of tense meetings and veiled threats from rivals, Claire returned to the apartment with exhaustion in her eyes. She sank into the worn couch, closing her eyes as Daniel set a cup of tea before her. For a moment, she let the weight fall away. No guards, no power. No empire, just her, and the man who had stood against death without hesitation. "You look tired," Daniel said quietly. She opened her eyes, managing a small smile. "I'm tired. But for once, I do not feel alone." Her words caught him off guard. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so stripped of the armor she wore before the world. He wanted to speak, to tell her that she was not alone, not anymore, before he could. Emily climbed into Claire's lap, her tiny hands resting against the curve of her stomach. "Will your baby be my friend?" Emily asked with the innocence only a child could hold. Claire's breath caught. Tears she had hidden for years threatened to fall. She held Emily close, her voice trembling. "Yes, sweetheart. I think my baby will be your best friend." Daniel watched them, his heart heavy and full all at once. In that simple exchange, something unspoken became clear. They were no longer strangers. They were no longer just a man, his daughter, and a woman from a different world. They were becoming something more, something fragile, something rare, something that felt like family. As winter approached, the threats reached a breaking point. One night, masked men attempted to storm Claire's mansion.
Ass.
But Daniel was there. Not as a hired guard, not as someone paid to stand in harm's way, but as a man who had already chosen his side. He fought with nothing but his bare hands and his unyielding will, driving them back alongside Claire's security team. The fight left him bruised and bloodied, but when the danger passed, Claire looked at him with eyes that held more than gratitude. They held trust, held something deeper. When the chaos settled, she whispered, "You should not have to fight my battles." Daniel, wiping the blood from his lip, answered simply, "They became my battles the night I stepped in front of. You and I do not regret it." That night, in the quiet after the storm, Claire made a decision she had long avoided. She moved closer, not just physically, but with her heart. She began to spend more nights at Daniel's apartment than in her mansion, choosing warmth over emptiness, choosing the laughter of a little girl over the cold silence of endless halls. Emily began to call her Aunt Claire, though Daniel knew it was more than that. He saw the way Emily's eyes lit up when Claire entered the room. It's the way she clung to her with the trust of a child who had found another protector. And though he said little, Daniel knew what was happening. From strangers bound by chance, they had become something much stronger. Months later, when Claire gave birth to her child, Daniel was there. He stood outside the hospital room, Emily asleep, in his arms, waiting anxiously. When the cries of a newborn filled the air, something inside him shifted forever. And when Claire finally emerged, holding her baby with tears streaming down her face, she looked at Daniel as if he were not just a man who had saved her life, but the man who had become part of it. She stepped forward, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Meet your new family." Daniel looked at the tiny child, then at Emily's sleeping face, and finally at Claire. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt something he thought he had lost forever: belonging. From that moment, three of them and soon four walked forward, not as strangers tied by circumstance, but as a family forged in fire, sacrifice, and love. The world outside still carried danger. Enemies still lurked, storms still brewed. But within the walls of that modest apartment, within the laughter of a child and the cries of a newborn, within the quiet strength of a father and the unyielding will of a mother, there was something greater than fear. There was home.